Welcome back, DMs. First, I wanted to give a shout out to Kiefer Marn's Monsters Know What They're Doing book and his follow-up, More Monsters Know What They're Doing. They totally changed how I looked at running my NPCs and monsters, and his blog is well worth a check out. I'll drop a link at the bottom. So this episode on the Master of Dungeons, I wondered what should we start with? What fantastical monster would be an interesting thing to begin with? And I decided, let's use my first BBEG from my homebrew game. This monster was a really interesting choice in my homebrew because it tied in very nicely with one of my PC's backstory. The player in question is playing an Oath of Devotion Paladin. Now, during character creation, I used the Heroic Chronicle that's in Explorer's Guide to Wildmount as I set the world in Wildmount, but also thought that it was a great way to create a character. It very much reminded me of the 20 questions at the beginning of Legend of the Five Rings. Now, in the Heroic Chronicle, there's a mysterious secret section, and one of the options says, I once saw a cat that seemed to be moving with a strange sense of purpose. I followed it to the dwelling of an important local elder, where it gazed through the window for an hour. Then it suddenly shook itself and raced away as though a spell had been broken. In my paladin's backstory, he said that the cat led him to a window where he saw a warlock attempting to summon a demon. He went into the residence and killed the warlock and sent his cousin, who was a watch officer, to investigate, and they discovered the body of the warlock god. So I asked myself what could have happened to that body, some demon, god, or patron, and then I looked and discovered the Deathlock. Now, the description of a Deathlock says, the forging of a pact between a warlock and patron is no minor occasion, at least not for the warlock. The consequences of breaking that pact can be dire and in some cases lethal. A warlock who fails to live up to a bargain with an evil patron runs the risk of rising from the dead as Deathlock, a foul undead driven to serve its otherworldly patron. So storyline-wise, we've got our hook. My paladin's cousin is hunting this corpse, and my party's paladin receives a letter from his cousin and heads off to meet him. But I kept him at a distance until I'm ready to add them into the story and start a combat. So I was building to this hunt from session 0 and held off until my party reached level 5. Eventually, after some tracking, they came to this city and discovered the warlock is still alive, has family in town, owns a mansion, and maintains the city cemetery, which backs into their property. That their family is prominent within the city and has been for the past 100 years, that they are a known warlock of a benevolent archfey and do a lovely ritual every few years to the local crops that actually, of course, turns out to be evil. Which means the first ability of the Deathlock's arsenal is their most important. One of the at-will spells, Disguise Self. So whenever they were seen in public, it was cast. Now, in their mansion, I had several gargoyles which, upon a detect magic spell, revealed illusion magic. And as these guys had been doing shady things about the city for the past century, I reasoned that at some point in their family's history, they commissioned the gargoyles to project a large illusion spell across the building. So whenever they were home, it would appear like they were regular people, even before becoming Deathlocks, and would extend to their nefarious allies. For those of you who have played Waterdeep Dragon Heist, you would recognise that I totally stole the idea from the Sea Maidens Fair, the group of ships run by Jarl Axel and his drow. Next, I looked at the cemetery. Now, this was my plan for their most nefarious actions. I mean, yes, evil things were happening in the mansion, but the real bad things were happening under a mausoleum within the cemetery. And then I remembered something great from Campaign 1 in Critical Role. It isn't mentioned hugely, but is amazing nonetheless. In part of the Briarwoods arc, Keyleth is attempting to speak with the Sun Tree. Now, for those of you who used the Amazon show to get all your information, it missed something vital in which was, because the Sun Tree was a blessing of a god, the Briarwoods cast the Hallow spell on the area, or Unhallow, to be exact. So my bad guys made the cemetery unhallowed ground. But what of the local temple, you ask? Well, the ruler of the city hates religion and only had a single temple of Bahamut within it. I wrote that the priest was fairly young after the last priest had retired and a new one was appointed. A thread my party never tugged on, but you can guess how alive this retired priest was and how competent the new young one was. With the Hollow spell, you get a 60-foot radius, and that the spell affects, which was the whole radius of the cemetery. And their evil underground lair only went down 50 feet, so all the spell's effects affected them underground too. Next, I looked at the effects of the spell, and first it allows you to ban certain creature types. Celestials, elementals, fae, fiends and undead can't enter the area unless the caster wishes. So I only allowed undead and fiends, in which meant the wizard's familiar and newly acquired level 4 spell summon fae had literally become useless. The next effect was my most important, where you can do something extra into the area, something like Courage, where affected creatures can't be frightened, or Everlasting Rest, where dead bodies interred can't be raised, which are useless to me and my evil boss, but they're not idiots. Their family has been here a while, and they know about the existence of paladins and clerics, and what they're likely to do to fiends and undead. So I gave energy protection. Affected creatures in the area have resistance to 1 damage type of your choice, except for bludgeoning, piercing and slashing. And what type of energy did I choose? You guessed it, radiant. That means the party's biggest heavy hitters' damage is doing half of what they expect, effectively doubling my Deathlock's HP, and that is before the party has even faced my BBEG. Then my party enters the cemetery and finds the mausoleum. I minor fight against a few zombies and a couple of zombie ogres, and then they head into the depths. Now, a lot of complaints and issues I've discovered of D&D 5e is the simple fact that until legendary monsters really show up with legendary actions and lair actions, a boss monster is at a severe disadvantage against a party of 4 to 6 players, especially if you roll badly on your initiative. The whole party can go before you, and by level 5, that's a lot of attacks coming your way and spells. But really, if you're an evil boss, why are you alone? Disposable minions are vital to your survival. So the first wave of disposable minions was the paladin's cousin and some other family members who went along with his cousin's police unit. These weren't just random family members, of course, they were also members of the Watch. A dozen zombies, but a nice hampering for the Deathlock before its next things turn up. Side note, before the main combat, I had been nice with my party. I had given a couple of them cool magic weapons, so some of their attacks they hit pretty hard. Foolish, I know, by level 5, but of course it meant that they bypassed the resistances to non-magic bludgeoning, piercing and slashing easily. Now, in my personal storyline, I surmised that the paladin's cousin and his unit arrived to cause a fuss, a fight ensued, and the officers killed the Deathlock's family, who are also warlocks, but the Deathlock, who I made a mastermind, killed them, then beseeched their patron to bring their family back to further the patron's goals, which made 1 member a Deathlock and 2 into Deathlock wights, which all works very nicely as they all have disguised self. The reason, of course, I created this own personal story for me, only me, is just to make it all logical in my head as to why these people all have become Deathlocks. How did a whole 12 watch become zombies? And what happened before my party arrived. Also, because my zombies had all been watch officers, I homebrewed a zombie and gave it half plate to show some zombies are just raised straight from whatever was killed, and the city watch would have had armour. The Deathlocks also all have mage armour, which they can cast at will, and any of you who have a caster in your party, or a warlock with Armour of Shadows, knows they're casting that spell immediately. So before combat even starts, I was all on the assumption that these casters had also cast mage armour, like they would every day and like your wizard does. Next, we need to address Multiverse of Madness. So the Deathlock and its cohorts originally appeared in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, which was the version I used. But Multiverse of Madness has created a new updated version, and I'll go over my tactics for using the originals in this fight and what my revised tactics would be. Let's first look at the Deathlock wight. It has great charisma and constitution for its level, a decent dex and wisdom, and an okay intelligence. It has resistance to necrotic damage, and thanks to Hollow, radiant resistance too. Its at-will spells are Detect Magic, which is completely useless in combat, Disguise Self, which is already up because it cast it to travel from the house to the cemetery, and Mage Armour, which is already cast. What the older version has that is lost in the new version, which is really upsetting, is Misty Step. And the reason it's really upsetting is because that's what I cast to instantly jump to the back of combat and get to the spellcasters. Because Misty Step is a bonus action to cast, and the wight has multi-attack, so it can attack twice, increasing the chance of dropping any concentration spells the caster may have. And Life Drain has a great attack because it drops the PC's hit point maximum, so they can't heal that back up until they rest. Instead, what I'd do now is have the wight cast Hold Person on someone it suspects of having a lowish wisdom, and then have a second multi-attack it. But hold on a minute, you ask, that's a bit metagaming, isn't it? Knowing who's got the lowest wisdom scores? But is it really? The wight has a +1 intelligence, and the Mastermind and Deathlock both have a +2, so they're smarter than the average person. But how do we show that intelligence? Well, they have life experience and some real-world knowledge, so I posit that they would probably know about the existence of druids, rangers, monks, or wise. Wizards and artificers are quite intelligent, barbarians are strong, and those sorts of things. They definitely aren't super evil geniuses that with enough life experience can work out exact ability scores, but certainly smart enough to work out the difference between a wizard and a barbarian. So casting Hold Person with one and attacking that person with the other is a solid 1-2 punch combination, especially used against a sorcerer or wizard who's up the back line, and they always have a ranged attack if they're a issue further away. Following on from the wight, I used single Deathlock in my combat. They're slightly less dexterous than the wight, but smarter. Again, they have the bludgeoning, piercing and slashing resistance to non-magical attacks, and resistance to necrotic, plus, thanks again to hollow, resistance to radiant. They have the same at-will spells the wight has, so again, detect magic is useless in combat. Disguise self is already up, as is mage armor. Now, Multiverse of Madness changed everything for casters. All of them cast at will rather than spell slots. So the original Deathlock worked just like a Warlock. It only had 2 level 3 spell slots, Chill Touch, Eldritch Blast and Mage Hand as cantrips. The spells it has are Arms of Hadar, Dispel Magic, Hold Person, Hunger of Hadar, Invisibility and Spider Climb. So as you only have 2 slots, Invisibility is your strongest opener. For a start, it's a level 3, which means it's upcast, so you can make a second creature invisible as well. So throwing that on a wight, zombie, or for this combat, what I did was the Mastermind, is unbelievably powerful, as their opening attack will be with advantage. Spider Climb is pretty pointless unless you're in serious trouble and surrounded and want to run up a wall out of the melee PC's reach. Hold Person is great for dealing with 2 melee PCs, especially if they're a fighter, barbarian or paladin, or any of that combination. Statistically, they'd have a lower wisdom, which a Deathlock would be smart enough to work out, and holding them in place so they're not battered to death is a fantastic idea, and being a level 3 spell works the same way as invisibility, targeting an additional creature, this case being 2 melee PCs about to smack your Deathlock in the face. Otherwise, you pretty much want to stay out of melee combat all you can and use Eldritch Blast like any good Warlock for their go-to ranged attack. If you have an abundance of melee PCs and not much range, the combination of Spider Climb and Eldritch Blast can be deadly. Arms of Hadar requires a strength check, so not really much use when enemies are up close, unless it's rogues and monks, because fighters, barbarians and paladins generally all love them some strength. And Hunger of Hadar on ranged is a dex save, personally I'd avoid it. Multiverse of Madness dropped all the cantrips from the Deathlock, but instead gave it multi-attack, which it can do 2 melee attacks or its 2 ranged attacks. However, Gravebolt is better than the previous Deathlock's Eldritch Blast. For a start, it adds a d10 damage die, although changes it from force to necrotic. So action economy has gone from 1 Eldritch Bolt to 2 Grave Bolts and an extra d10 bolt per, being a possible 4 d10 per attack rather than just a single d10. All its spells are 1 each per day, and they dropped Arms of Hadar. Another great plan then would be to cast Invisibility and then Grave Bolt with advantage, following turn Spider Climb, run at wall, and then Grave Bolt at range. Any concentration spells that your party bring to bear that can be quite annoying, Dispel Magic is on hand to get rid of that. If they do something tricky that keeps you to the same spot, you have Deathly Claw, which are the same in both versions of the Deathlock, but what makes the one for Multiverse better is you get multi-attack. Lastly, the Deathlock Mastermind. The Mastermind has the same at-will spells, so yet again Mage Armor and Disguise Self would probably already be up, and it has some resistances, plus the juicy one we gave our monsters from Hollow. It has a better charisma intelligence save, as spells using those stats are pretty rare, but also some of the most fun. I've noticed players like to take. You'll probably see them because they see monsters having high strength and con saves all the time, and so avoid those spells. More or less they want the thematic side of it. The original version, like the Deathlock, works like a warlock. It has 2 level 5 slots, loses Eldritch Blast as a cantrip, but gets Grave Bolts. Grave Bolts are better than any of its cantrips, just ignore them unless it's for something thematic. So first thing first, with only 2 spell slots, you're definitely holding on to 1 for Dimension Door. Why would they hold on to Dimension Door? Because your mastermind isn't an idiot. It has enough intelligence to want to preserve its own life. And once it gets down to half health or less, or takes 30 damage in a single turn, it's probably thinking these guys might wipe me out, so time to get out of here. Which also means that if the PCs have a caster and throw up a counterspell, you want to counter their counterspell with your other slot. Which means your spell slots are pretty useless, so you're left with Gravebolt and a desire for self-preservation. Fortunately, the Deathlock in this combat encounter, he's already upcast invisibility, which incorporates this mastermind, so he's invisible and has advantage for his first Gravebolt attack. Now, with my combat, my mastermind was different. It wanted revenge against the paladin that had murdered her, so what she did first was cast Darkness and split the combat in half, separating the casters from melee fighters. I still held Dimension Door ready to flee, but a counterspell shut that down, and so I couldn't escape. But I wasn't upset, as this was my BBEG on my first chapter, so it was meant to die, and I wasn't too upset about it not returning again. Most monsters will want to preserve their lives. Over time I'll show some that don't really care, but look at life and nature. Animals like lions pick off the weak prey and don't go taking on the strongest. Criminals prey on individuals alone and weak, not a group of strong threats. So your NPCs should be thought of in the same way. The multiverse version changes a lot of the combat. The first thing it has, which is amazing, is Devil's Sight. Devil's Sight is a great invocation for warlocks, which means that a warlock can see in darkness, including magical darkness. It's a rare ability to be able to see in magical darkness. It costs a Shadow Sorcerer sorcery points, an Astral Self Monk key, a warlock an invocation, and so on. But dark vision is useless, and what is one of these spells the mastermind can cast once a day? Yep, you've guessed it, darkness. Now let's assume you're using the multiverse versions of the Deathlock. Invisibility no longer upcast, so the Deathlock casts it, but only affects themselves. So what does the mastermind do? Granted, they have their own invisibility, but it only lasts until they attack, giving a single round of advantage. But casting darkness on their staff, because cast on an item rather than an area, and it moves with the caster, which is a much better choice, as you can have this up for up to 10 minutes. Provided PC casters don't dispel or counter it, you're already onto a stronger tactic, being able to use Grave Bolts every turn, which are a multi-attack and at advantage. Then target the casters as well, just to force the healers to keep them in the fight, and the melee fighters are lesser of a threat. Also, the great thing about Gravebolt is on a strength save, it restrains your enemies. The mastermind has an intelligence of 15, so it's not an idiot. Definitely knows your barbarian and paladins hit hard, and that your wizards and sorcerers probably have a struggle punching out of a wet paper bag. So chuck your Gravebolts at them and watch them struggle to cause you any bad effects, and use a screen of minions to protect your mastermind from the melee fighters. You also have 1 per day casting of Dimension Door that isn't tied to spell slots, so are less worried about not being able to cast it. If there is a lot of melee fighters and they can see in your darkness, you have Fly to rain bolts down upon their heads. Unfortunately, the mastermind loses counterspell, but the trade-off for Devil's Sight is worth it, and we still have a handy dispel magic for any pesky concentration spells hanging around. On a side note, I also ignored the patron-specific. Patron-specific spells, which I don't really think they're very good here for what we require. Anyway, this has been my look at Deathlocks. I hope it helps and gives you ideas on making fun, interesting combat for your parties. Until next time, happy hunting.